Hello friends, welcome to Kumar IAS, and I hope that your preparation is going on full swing. We were studying political science series. We have completed Western political thought, and now we started political theory, its meaning and its approaches. The brief introduction of the meaning of political theory we studied in the last video. If you have any doubt, please do ask in the comment box. I will definitely and personally answer your queries. So, in today's lecture, we are going to study the approaches of political theory. So, without much delay, आज की कथा को शुरू करते हैं. So, in approaches of political theory, there are basically two approaches we can say: traditional approach and modern approach. So, first of all, we'll study the traditional approaches. In traditional approaches, the first approach is called the philosophical or normative approach. Normative basically means right or wrong. For example, we say telling a lie is wrong. Telling a lie is wrong. So, this is normative. Norms. Norms basically means only right and wrong. And Plato is known as father of normative or philosophical approach. I hope that no need to explain the point because Plato gave theory of justice, and Plato's all the theories, all his book Republic, everything is completely loaded with norms, values, right, wrong, man of copper, man of gold, blah blah blah. Okay, so Plato is father of normative or philosophical approach in that sense. Philosophical approach is basically prescriptive. Prescriptive means it says the reader what should they do. What should they do? And traditional theories are quite prescriptive in that sense. Normative basically means forward looking. Forward looking means there is some substance, there is some plan for future, futuristic, that if there is justice, if the society is just, there will not be revolution. Aristotle says revolution will be avoided if there is justice in the society. So in that sense, it is futuristic or forward looking, because for norms there is always some underlying theme. If there are few norms, why they are being followed, there is always a reason, and there is always a future goal. There is always an end, which is achieved through the norms, through the values. Why you follow something? That's why this is called the normative or philosophical approach. Justice, liberty, all these values, they are part of norms. They are always normative and forward looking. Then philosophical or normative approach, the classic feature of this is reasoning and dialectics. Dialectic means, as Plato says, that truth emerges out of dialectics. Truth emerges out of dialectics. Truth emerges out of dialectics. Why? Because if you reason and there is counter reason and then again there is reason, in that scheme of things, finally the truth emerges. Finally the truth emerges. And reasoning is the key feature of dialectics. If you do not have reason, how you can argue and counter argue? So reason is the primary feature of dialectics. So these what are crucial features of the philosophical or normative approach. Then what are the criticisms? As we saw in the meaning of political theory, that political theory is the most democratic discipline. It is the most democratic discipline. So most democratic means only that it is always open for criticism, which is also called the principle of falsification. Falsification principle basically means that it is always open for criticism, and the criticism of the traditional approach is that it is divorced from the reality. बोलते हैं ना, हवा में घूम रहा है ये आदमी, बहकी बहकी बातें कर रहा है, which is not standing on the reality. As Marx says to Hegel that Hegel is standing on his head. That basically means like this, it's upside down. And that sort is the criticism of normative approach. That normative approaches, they are, sort of not based on the reality. What is happening around you, that is not addressed in the normative approaches. Normative approaches are always like the lofty goals, the lofty ideals, the idealism, and what ought to be. What ought to be. Normative means what ought to be. It never means what is. So what is and what ought to be, they both are quite different, and normative approaches are criticized that they are addressing what ought to be, but they are not standing, or they are not addressing the issue of what is. What is right now, that is more important. So there is always fear of biasness, and it is non-verifiable. Why there is fear of biasness? Because the individual opinions are supreme. The individual opinions are always getting supremacy. That's why it is always said that it may be biased. There is always fear of biasness, and it cannot be verified. Justice is the supreme virtue. Plato says that justice is the supreme virtue. How you will verify it? There is no way of verifying the thing, that what is the supreme virtue or not. No, you cannot. And then Plato, like Aristotle, says that if the rulers are following these things, there will be no revolution, or there will be revolution. So these things cannot be quantifiably verified, like in a laboratory. Intuitively they seems right. If you go on intuition, then they feels right. Justice is always the first virtue. The society which is not just, they are just waiting for the collapse. So intuitively it's right, but then you cannot verify. And by the way, by the time you verify, the time is already gone, because if revolution happens, there is no going back. The complete system changes. So in that sense, they are non-verifiable. And at present, it seems there is some error, technical glitch. At present, the scholars like Macpherson, Rawls, they represent the tradition of normative approaches. For example, Rawls' theory of justice, Macpherson's theory of democracy, then Derrida, Foucault, they just do value analysis. We'll study them later on in detail. So now let's move to the second approach. In traditional, the first is philosophical, the second one is historical. The historical approach is one of the oldest. सबसे पुराने approaches में से एक है, and its exponent we can say Machiavelli. Okay, before moving on, why it is oldest? Because to read the history or to learn from the history, it is the part and parcel of any human being. So as such, the historical approach becomes as old as political theory itself. And in traceable way we can say that its exponent is Machiavelli. No need to explain why. If you have not watched the previous lectures, please do watch them, because political science is very scientific discipline. And if you do not know the context of the things, if you do not know the basics of political science, Western political thought, these later on all these lectures will become very very difficult for you. You may not grasp liberty, equality, this political theory, whatever topics we are studying in the part 1 of paper 1, part A of paper 1. So if you have not watched the previous lectures, please do watch them, because then it will be very clear to you then why Machiavelli is called the exponent of historical approach. Now I cannot explain everything again and again what I already explained in the previous lectures. So it is your duty to watch the previous lectures first. Machiavelli always says to the prince that it is the history which will save the prince. The prince should be worldly wise rather than being wise in the world of ideas. The world of ideas basically means idealism, but Machiavelli says that the prince may not be idealistic; he should be cold-blooded. So these all are advices, and for that he says that the prince should not study religion; he should study the history. That's what the advice of Machiavelli to the prince. That's why Machiavelli is called the father of historical approach, because he systematically established this tradition. And this historical approach actually dominates the discipline of international relations, because in international relations it is says that history is eternal wisdom. History is eternal wisdom. And history gives us a lot of lessons. It is also said that realism is eternal wisdom, and Selle says that politics is the present history and the history is the past politics. So profoundly explained in one line that why international relations or international politics is dominated by the historical approach. Politics is the present history and history is the past politics. That's why you cannot ignore history in politics and politics in history. I hope you understand. If you do not understand any point, please do ask in the comment box. I will personally answer that. It is said that if history is the root, the politics is the fruit. And every thinker is the child of his times, as very pertinently put by the Lasky. And if every thinker is child of his times, then if you do not know the history of that time, then how you can study that thinker? And in the Western political thought, I always emphasized on the times of any scholar. If you understand the history and if you understand the time of that scholar, you can very well explain that scholar, the nuances of that scholar, the intricacies of his theory. Everything is very easily grasped if you know the history of that time. As such, the historical approach becomes very, very crucial for understanding the politics of a particular time and a thinker. And Sabine, moreover, says that the historical approach fulfills the three requirements of a sound approach. He says that it is just a common sense based approach because you can verify the facts, because it is always at hindsight, and to judge the things in hindsight, that's quite easy. And historical approach provides you that cushion, it provides you that luxury. And then evaluative, you can always evaluate again the benefit of hindsight, which is not available in many other approaches. So that's why it is called a very very sound approach. And the causal factor is always taken care of. What was the cause of the thing? It just comes in the evaluative point. So there is always root is always the history, and the politics, what politicians do, it is always the fruit. And it can be very well explained by the Mandal and Kamandal politics in Indian context. Mandal and Kamandal. So the politics during the time of Rajiv Gandhi, the VP Singh, and the famous case of Shahbano. So that is the root, the history, but its fruit is now eaten by BJP. And the politics of Hindutva, the politics, Dalit politics, like minority politics, minority appeasement. So through these examples, you can very well explain this, that how history and politics are always related. If history is the root, the politics is the fruit. Who is eating the fruit? Politician of this time. And then what are the criticisms and limits of the historical approach? So the first thing is that history is extremely vast. You can just cherry pick the version which suits you. For example, done by Hegel and Karl Marx. Misuse of history. They will take the parts of history which is suitable for their particular theory, and that's not very wise thing to do. So that is one limitation of historical approach. Then there is always fear of biasness in this also, because there is knowledge power connection, and you can very well give example from the part 1b of a political science paper. There is Dalit perspective of Indian freedom movement. There is the Dalit perspective of Indian freedom movement. There is subaltern perspective. So the same Indian freedom movement, but then there are different histories, different version of histories. History is quite different. Dalit perspective looks completely different from the Gandhian view. The Gandhian historians and the left scholars or the left historians, their version seems quite, somewhere even converging, but quite different, significantly different. And then if you take the rightist view, then it is very, very different. So we can always say that there is knowledge power connection, and there is always possibility that there will be biasness in the interpretation of history. And then if we focus too much on history, then we become prisoners of history. We just become prisoners of history, and we always keep on going in the past. We just dwell in the past. We do not see in the future. We always dwell in the past. And that example can be given of Russia's relation with the West. That is quite a good example. For example, the economic sanctions on Russia, because the West cannot come out of the past biasness, and then the Russia's fear from NATO and the Ukraine crisis of present times, they always are good example of being prisoners of history. And then there can be selective use. It is somewhere similar to the misuse of history. Selective use like Machiavelli, and we just take one subset of the complete set. And then whatever we may say, the conclusion of historical approach is that history will always be useful guide. And Machiavelli says that a prince should never ignore the advice given by history. Never ignore. It may be biased, it may be selective, whatever, but no wise prince will ever he will ever take the risk of ignoring the history. Never ever. And then the next approach is empirical approach, observation based approach, and it can always be judged in true or false because you observe it directly. And it is also as old as philosophical approach. For example, the Plato gave his theory in the context of situation of Athens. So it was basically empirical approach, because he was witnessing something and he gave theory with respect to that. Then Aristotle, the theory of constitution. He studied the constitution of more than 158 countries, then he gave theory of constitution. So again, it is empirical based approach. Then Machiavelli, his statecraft, he says that as things are rather than ought to be. He says that a prince should know the things as they are rather than as they ought to be. So that will only happen if the prince is taking empirical observations into account. And then we can also take the example of John Locke. He says that mind is tabula rasa. That basically means that mind, there are impressions on mind, impressions based on the empirical observations. Mind is tabula rasa because there are impressions on mind based on empirical observations. So in that sense, the empirical approach can directly answer this question of true and false, which was one of the shortcomings of the first one, philosophical approach. Because in philosophy you just can't say true or false, because you cannot see the things. In empirical approach, you can personally witness the things and then you can give your theory. Then what are the negatives or the criticism of empirical approach? It is status quoist. It is always supporting the system. Like, it is not taking in view of history or the future. It is just status quoist. It supports what is already existing. It sort of creates a binary and bias. It creates binary and bias towards the present. It makes you biased towards present because you are focusing only on present. Now whatever is happening in the present, it may not be only influenced by the present events. There is always a history for some present, and there is always the possibility of different factors. But empirical approach is quite biased towards present. That's why it is called status quoist. And we can conclude with the thing that it is rightly and first step towards scientific approach. Scientific approach will study in the behavioral movement. Scientific approach is quite rigorous, but nevertheless it is definitely the first step, because the observation or empirical observation is the first step in the direction of any scientific approach. So we hope that these approaches are quite clear to you. The remaining approaches we'll study in the next video, and we hope that you are enjoying the political science lectures. And if you have any doubt, please do ask in the comment box. I will personally answer them. So if you like the videos, please subscribe the channel and please spread the word like a wildfire, because everybody cannot afford the costly coaching of Delhi. And friends, till next video, stay connected and work hard. We hope that will definitely add value to your civil services preparation. Thank you so much for coming to S. Kumar IAS.